Guys, just because somebody appears on the Dr. Phil show claiming that she's pregnant with the reincarnation of Jesus Christ doesn't necessarily make it so. Just because someone appears on Dr. Phil and claims that the rapper Eminem is her biological father doesn't make it necessarily so. If you describe yourself with the word skeptic, if you have a YouTube channel and the word skeptic is in the name of your channel, you're supposed to be one of the people on the side that asks careful, methodologically sound questions before leaping to conclusions, before believing or assuming anything that reaches beyond direct empirical experience. And that's a tradition that goes back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, an ancient author called Sextus Empiricus. And there's only one modern idea in the philosophy of skepticism. There's only one thing that was added to this in the 20th century, and that's the concept of falsifiability that was developed and propounded by the philosopher of the scientific method known as Karl Popper. He did philosophy of science, whatever you want to call it. Okay? What's the opposite of skepticism? The opposite of skepticism is dogmatism. Skeptics should not really be embarrassed to be wrong. Being wrong is something that happens to human beings. You might really find it convincing when you're on PewDiePie's channel watching that video letting you know that a young woman is pregnant with the next incarnation of Jesus and her biological father is Eminem, which would technically mean that Eminem is God. Fascinating. Fascinating, and shout out to PewDiePie. Thank you for bringing me up to date with this story. Thank you for poisoning / enriching my life and mind with this completely trivial news story from the Dr. Phil show. The opposite of skepticism is dogmatism, and it is dangerous. Dangerous in the truest sense of the word. When you have someone like the armored skeptic who dogmatically propounds, dogmatically believes something as simple as the claim that, quote, antidepressants solve a chemical imbalance in the brain. I'm going to now go to a long series of clips contrasting what armored skeptic says to what some scientists and experts say in the field. But guys, it wouldn't take a genius to just read the fine print that's now written on every bottle of Prozac. It wouldn't take a genius to do a little bit of Google searching and a little bit of fact checking and to realize how genuinely contestable these claims are. And even if you don't come to a conclusion, to do that most basic thing that skepticism requires. Skepticism isn't about coming to conclusions. Skepticism isn't about always being right. Skepticism isn't about never being wrong. Being wrong is something that happens to human beings, and it's part of the scientific process. Skepticism is about admitting to yourself when you do not know. The skeptics were the people who, back in ancient Greece, back in ancient Rome, were willing to say, hey, some people think the world is flat. Some people think the world is round like a sphere. Actually, one of the most popular theories that the world was more shaped like a drum or a segment of a column. And guess who the skeptics were in that debate? The skeptics were the people who said, there's evidence on all sides, there's conflicting theories, and we don't know yet. Today we do. In 2018, you can put the pieces together and figure out the shape of the planet we're living on. But skeptics, by definition, were the people who refused to take that step into dogmatism, into certainty about something they did not know. And shame on you, armored skeptic. What you're doing here is more dangerous to the people you're giving advice to the public at large, than if you came out and said, hey, 10 days of heavy drinking, 10 days of vodka is a great way to shake yourself out of manic depression. All right? I'm familiar with vodka. I quit drinking basically when I was still a teenager, but I'm familiar with the effects of vodka. And you know what? The side effects of vodka aren't nearly so dangerous, aren't nearly so terrifying in the long term as what you're about to hear about antidepressants and antipsychotics that are now also used to treat depression, about classes of prescription drug that in fact have been debunked since the early 1980s. A class of drugs that here is being dogmatically glorified by someone who calls himself a skeptic, who's stepping way outside of his field of expertise, giving medical advice on a subject, giving pseudoscientific medical advice on a subject on which really he ought to have the maturity and attachment to say, hey, there are some things, like whether or not the earth is flat, whether or not Eminem is your father, that maybe this guy just doesn't know.
À-bas-le-ciel.
Antidepressants are designed to help you regulate your brain chemistry. The opposite of depression is not happiness. The opposite of depression is balanced brain chemistry.
Has anyone ever told you that you had a biochemical imbalance? Did you go to the doctor feeling anxious or stressed or depressed and have them say, oh yeah, it's genetic, it's biochemical, you need a psychiatric drug? Well, you might be surprised to learn that the only biochemical imbalances in the brains of people who see psychiatrists are the ones put in there by the psychiatrists. We don't have any evidence that any routine psychiatric problem, from anxiety to depression and even schizophrenia, has anything to do with a biochemical imbalance. So where did an idea like that come from?
The first drugs that were thought of as antidepressants were actually similar. They were drugs that were used to treat TB, and they were similar to stimulants. They had similar effects to amphetamines, and the first articles about them make that quite clear. They describe how they could make people psychotic and very agitated and prevent them sleeping. But then they start to be described as antidepressants. They start to be portrayed as specifically attacking mood or depressive symptoms. There's even less evidence for the serotonin or monoamine theory of depression, which you've probably heard of. And it's now widely acknowledged by experts that there really is no evidence that there are any serotonin abnormalities in people with depression, even though that idea was so widely promoted in the 90s, particularly when the SSRIs were being marketed.
Brain chemistry is the key to depression, but the brain is really complex. A treatment that may work for one person will not work at all for another, or maybe even have the opposite effect. Everyone's brain processes those chemicals differently.
Psychiatric drugs are psychoactive substances, and this is sometimes forgotten, so this is just why I'm putting this slide up. There is no fundamental difference between them and other psychoactive substances. The ones we're familiar with, of course, are the substances that are used recreationally. The difference might be that most psychiatric drugs produce states that are not particularly pleasant, but that doesn't mean that they're fundamentally different in any way. They still, like all drugs, alter the body, and like all psychoactive drugs, because they work on the brain, they produce altered mental states as well. And like all drugs, they produce tolerance. That is, the effects that they have initially don't necessarily last because the body adapts to their presence, and for the same reasons you get withdrawal symptoms when they're stopped.
Some people need a lot to feel stimulated. Others are extremely sensitive to even the smallest imbalance.
Like other psychoactive substances, the state that they produce means that people are not necessarily very good at judging how they're functioning when they're under the influence of the drug. What someone called Peter Breggin, an American psychiatrist, has called a process of spellbinding.
The Federal Drug Administration is taking a hard look at the evidence. The FDA now wants the makers of Paxil, Prozac, Zoloft, and others to mention suicide as a side effect on warning labels, and doctors have been ordered to closely monitor patients.
I mean, it's ironic when you think about it, isn't it, that a drug that's marketed as an antidepressant has a side effect of suicide.
To take the irony further now, the FDA's new label warnings and the Canadian, read like my books from 10 years ago, that these drugs produce anxiety, insomnia, overstimulation, impulsivity, aggressivity, hostility, and a general worsening of their condition.
Antidepressants are designed to help you regulate your brain chemistry, allowing you to function without the distraction of emotional instability. Yes, some drugs will make you feel kind of dull, but that's the trade-off you take.
They seem to have two sorts of contrasting effects. The modern antidepressants, anyway, the SSRIs and various other more recently marketed antidepressants, they seem to induce a state of lethargy and listlessness and drowsiness, but at the same time seem to make some people at least rather agitated and panicky and tense and irritable. I should say actually that they're much milder psychoactive substances than many of the other drugs that are used and prescribed for mental health problems. So in many people they don't have many effects at all. And I think if we were talking to people honestly, we'd present antidepressants in a very different way from the way that they are currently presented. So the way they are currently presented by many doctors and by drug companies is this idea that they will help to normalize an underlying chemical imbalance, or at the very least there's a hint or an implication that they will normalize whatever's going on that's causing the depression. If we were taking a drug-centered approach, this is what I think we would say to people, okay? This drug affects the way people think and feel, but we don't really know how yet, because we haven't studied it enough. It may dampen down emotions, suppress your libido, we know it does that, may make you feel a bit lethargic and drowsy, and some people it might make them feel a bit agitated. Do you think that would be helpful?
The opposite of depression is not happiness. The opposite of depression is balanced brain chemistry.
We don't have any evidence that any routine psychiatric problem, from anxiety to depression and even schizophrenia, has anything to do with a biochemical imbalance. So where did an idea like that come from? We know the answer. It was actually made up by the brilliant minds at the drug company, Eli Lilly.
But then, in the 1980s, there was a crisis over the widespread use of benzodiazepines, and the idea of using mind-altering substances to shut people up, keep people quiet, stop people complaining, got a very bad reputation, rightly, of course. And so as David Healy's very cleverly shown, they started to change the market for the benzodiazepines into a market for antidepressants. And they needed to get away from that bad reputation. They needed to portray the antidepressants as something that were reversing an underlying disease. So that disease-centered model became very important to them in the early 1990s. And then more recently, of course, we've seen the creation of other conditions, or the changing nature of other conditions like bipolar disorder, to sell new drugs. So this is what I was saying about antidepressants. So the idea that there was an underlying deficiency or disease was sold in a package with the drugs. They very much came together, the idea that you had a chemical imbalance and therefore you needed an antidepressant in the 1990s with the marketing of the SSRIs like Prozac. And Eli Lilly were one of the funders of a big campaign in the UK, and I know there have been campaigns here and campaigns in Australia that are similar, campaigns designed to increase the use of antidepressants by increasing the number of people who are diagnosed with depression. So this campaign suggested that 5% of the general population had depression, 10% of people attending general practitioners. It emphasized that antidepressants are not addictive, which has transpired as completely wrong and is now accepted as completely wrong. And it emphasized that they should be given for a few months and not just used for a brief period. It was very successful. We've already seen how much the prescribing of antidepressants has increased.
We all have to play an active role in our battle with depression. You can't just pop a pill and expect your problems to go away. Just because you've managed to overcome some of the symptoms of depression doesn't mean that you no longer have depression.
And what they've been doing is trying to persuade people. The makers of antipsychotics, and the antipsychotics are the big blockbusters at the moment, the new antipsychotics like Zyprexa and Seroquel, they've been trying to get into the depression market because they know that there's many more people, out there with depression than with psychosis. And the way that they've been doing this, in part anyway, is through this diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So a lot of their advertisements have been about trying to persuade people who might view themselves as being depressed that actually they've got bipolar and therefore they need an antipsychotic. The advertising and promotion has been very emotive, and a lot of it has been justified by this idea that psychotic symptoms are toxic to the brain. So they have to be stopped at the earliest point possible. You need to prescribe as early as possible. It turns out that it's probably the antipsychotics that are toxic to the brain, that all the evidence that people saw that the brains of people with schizophrenia and psychosis were getting slightly smaller over the first few months of their treatment, it looks as if that's attributable to their drug treatment rather than the disorder. So in particular, I've got a macaque monkey up here because the middle line refers to a study. Well, sorry, I should say first, Jeffrey Lieberman, who's a psychiatrist based in America, conducted a trial which was sponsored by Eli Lilly, which compared haloperidol and olanzapine and brain scanned people for a year, followed them up for a year, and found that within 12 weeks there was evidence of shrinkage in people taking haloperidol, and over a year there was evidence of the same shrinkage in people on olanzapine as well, but to a slightly lesser degree. They concluded that what this showed was that olanzapine prevented the underlying brain shrinkage better than haloperidol. And they were obviously convinced about this conclusion because Eli Lilly then funded this study with macaque monkeys, which did the same thing, compared haloperidol, olanzapine, and monkeys that were treated without any drugs, and showed conclusively that the brains of these monkeys were smaller in the monkeys treated with olanzapine and haloperidol than the monkeys treated without the drugs. They were given some placebo injections instead. And then there's been a long-term follow-up study done here as well, which also suggests that there was a strong correlation between the shrinkage of the brain and the amount of antipsychotics that people were prescribed. This trend started to label children with what was called paediatric bipolar disorder. Going back a couple of decades, it wasn't believed that children could have bipolar disorder. It was thought to be something that only started later in life. But then there was this idea that pediatric bipolar disorder can be manifested in different ways from adult bipolar disorder. And this group at Harvard started to do trials with children, some preschool children, testing them with antipsychotics, diagnosing them with bipolar disorder. It turned out they were receiving enormous amounts of money from the pharmaceutical industry, which they hadn't declared.
It is not yet clear if antidepressants do trigger suicide attempts, but there is definitely enough concern for the FDA to issue this warning. And until it gets answers, 10 drug makers must change their warning labels, and those taking the drugs will be monitored.
This is hard for me because I tried to commit suicide in front of my 5 children. I didn't know what I was doing. I don't remember exactly what happened. All I know is that my husband took the gun away from me and my children was looking from the other room. If my husband wasn't there, I wouldn't be here. My children wouldn't have a mother.
One woman earlier spoke of nearly committing suicide in front of her children. My sister did commit suicide in front of Lindsay. Another woman spoke of hollow point bullets. That's what my sister used to do it. My sister would have never killed herself in front of this little girl. She would have never done that. Prozac induced her to do that.
I attacked him with a kitchen knife. Luckily, he's bigger and stronger than I am, and he defended himself. But I did this right in front of my son. I thought, I can't believe what I'm doing. I don't believe what I'm doing. This is wrong. Then I decided that I was going to kill myself.
The bottom line is, I was never suicidal before taking Prozac. I was obsessed with suicide while taking Prozac, and the obsession stopped immediately after I stopped taking Prozac.
Unfortunately, with my dad, we didn't have time to notice too many changes, except that he became withdrawn and agitated. But by that time, it was too late. He got up at 9 o'clock in the morning, took a 12-inch butcher knife out of the kitchen drawer and stabbed himself violently in the abdomen once, and then proceeded to do it twice.
By the 14th day, I was experiencing such intensified fear that I could not stand to face life as it was for me anymore. There was, to my mind, no hope and no future. Where suicide had never been a logical solution for any reason for me, it now became my only solution because I had nothing left with which to fight, and I was terrified to go on living.
This drug is most assuredly responsible for any torment or suffering and the eventual suicide of my husband.
I was totally out of control. My friends were aghast at my deteriorating mental state, but were afraid to speak to me about it because of my agitated state of mind. During this time, it is a miracle I did not harm myself or others. I had become a menace to society, and the FDA is allowing this to happen. I want to know why. How many more people are going to be killed and maimed before you do something? You have the power to change things. You have the power to listen to what we say and investigate what we say. We need help.
And some say the FDA eventually could ban the use of antidepressants altogether.
15 years ago, I warned the FDA and I warned the country in toxic psychiatry that antidepressants were causing a stimulant amphetamine-like syndrome that was resulting in violence and murder. In 1994, in talking back to Prozac, I warned the country and the FDA again, this time with tons now of scientific data on the same issues. During that period of time, I was asked to be, and this is very relevant to your deliberations, the scientific investigator for all of the combined Prozac suits, almost 200 of them. So I got to look at all the sealed data that Eli Lilly didn't want anybody else to see. So about 20 books later now, and a few dozen scientific studies, and innumerable product liability suits where I've looked at sealed data, I've come to tell you that you're evaluating junk. You're evaluating carefully edited, expurgated data that I've seen and you haven't. This is a most remarkable circumstance.
À-bas-le-ciel.
The very first thing you're going to find in the description below this video is a link to a playlist of other videos basically on exactly the same topic as this one. And just a few days ago, I put up a video, much more brief, succinct, and to the point, dealing with the rousing endorsement of antidepressant drugs from skeptic YouTuber Jacqueline Glenn. Now, part of the question I've raised here in this video is, what does the word skeptic mean anymore? A lot of us need to go back and re-examine our assumptions about biopsychiatry and about antidepressants. A lot of us also need to go back and re-examine our philosophical assumptions about the meaning of skepticism, the meaning of dogmatism, and then how we apply these concepts in our lives. There's not a lot of heroism, really, for someone like Jacqueline Glenn or for someone like Armored Skeptic to beat up on Christianity in the decadent West, in the United States of America. You know what? It takes guts. It takes balls to stand up to the Muslim establishment in Saudi Arabia. Being an atheist, being a voice for atheist activism, for skepticism in that sense, within the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia, that takes nerve. Being a voice for reform, challenging the institutions of Buddhism in Thailand today, takes nuts, takes nerve, takes backbone. There's risk involved. If you want equal rights for women within Buddhism in Thailand, if you want to separate church and state, get the king, disentangle the power of the government from Buddhism, stop having Buddhist monks preaching government policy and stop having government policy being dictated by Buddhist monks, any of these reforms, hey, you might want to stand up for actual atheism, skepticism, what have you within Buddhism too. There might be all kinds of things you want to do. Yeah, it actually does take nerve in some of these places where the power of church and state have not been disentangled, where it's really your skin on the line, where you're facing prison sentences, or you're just facing the possibility of being outright murdered by religious fundamentalists. And, you know, I think that people like Jacqueline Glenn and Armored Skeptic, they're kind of, you know, they're wearing the skin of the lion. Their fame on the internet came up. They had this aura of heroism because they stood up and liberated themselves from the chains of faith, which is something most of us did. Most of you watching this video, something we did as children at such an early age that we can barely remember. I mean, I don't know if there's a sense in which you can say you're an atheist from birth, But a lot of us questioned or rejected Christianity or Judaism at such an early age that we don't really remember the reasoning that went into it. Nevertheless, when other people go through this infantile process of intellectual development as teenagers or as fully grown adults, we seem to treat them as heroes, even when there is really fundamentally nothing heroic about it. Okay? Why? Because it evokes this idea of speaking truth to power. It evokes the historical memory of Galileo standing up and risking his life to say no. He believes that the earth rotates around the sun and not vice versa, that the sun rotates around the earth, and being put on trial by the Catholic Church. The witch trials and all the barbarity of the Dark Ages being challenged by the supposedly noble man of science. When you look into the real biography of what really happened with Galileo, there's a lot more moral complexity to it. But nevertheless, that's the symbol that someone like Galileo has become. That's the symbol that someone like Copernicus has become. Again, Copernicus is actually a very different historical figure when you look into what his life really was and what the challenge to church authority was that he presented and so on. Nevertheless, whether it's the church reformer or Martin Luther posting his objections to the church, or it's an outright atheist or what have you, these people appear to us wearing the skin of a lion. And examples that are just slightly inconvenient for their personal lifestyle choices, whether it's eating meat, drinking alcohol, or getting high on antidepressants. We see that these are heroes with feet of clay. They're not just phony YouTube personalities, they are phony skeptics. If you care about public health, if you care about the damage that is being done by pseudoscience being popularized on the internet, you should hate these people who themselves are crusaders against pseudoscience. If you hate dogmatism, you should hate these people who present themselves as the enemies of dogmatism. Precisely those who care most about skepticism, in a meaningful sense of the word, ought to be the most scandalized at the people who today, on YouTube, on the level of C-list celebrities, have come to represent skepticism. And my heart goes out to you, because I'm a vegan, and I care about the future of the vegan movement. And one of the main reasons I got on YouTube and started making videos about veganism, I've now made about 1,000, by the way, and reached over 2 million people in my audience, blah, 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 blah. It's been a lot of effort, is that I saw exactly the people who were the most popular, most renowned voices for the vegan movement dragging the name of veganism through the mud. Nobody was discrediting veganism more than precisely the people who stepped forth claiming to represent veganism. And you guys in the so-called skeptic community or skeptic movement or new atheist movement today, you have to face up to this fact that nobody is discrediting skepticism more than your own self-identified leaders.
À-bas-le-ciel.